Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins on a very moonlit and dark night. Many warriors gathered in front of the estate to defend it and prevent the enemies from breaking through. There was a lot of fire around. Everyone had weapons. People were screaming either from pain when they were hit or from rage. At the same time, a very beautiful lady was sitting in the estate. Her window was open, so she could hear all these loud screams perfectly well. The girl also heard the explosions that were happening there, and she was a little afraid of this, sitting with her arms crossed on the couch and praying. The girl really wanted God to take her into his arms without too much pain, because she didn't want anything in the world to die with crazy pain at the same time. She sat with her eyes closed and breathing heavily, so she hoped that she would still be allowed to resist this pain. And ultimately, she would like these warriors who were now fighting for the estate to continue to believe in God's plans and endure, and never give up. But soon, this could not be done, because other warriors were able to break through, and the gates became open. So one of the army commanders ordered that everyone arrest the traitors. As soon as this lady heard all these screams, she immediately understood that things were not good at all. She understood perfectly well that pain is a feeling, but the fruit of patience will be very sweet, so she must stand to the last. At this very time, warriors had already managed to break into the estate. They killed various guards along the way and said that they absolutely had to find this girl. Of course, they were chasing after the lady who, sitting in her chambers, prayed for forgiveness and mercy, because the men didn't know for sure. They had to go into each room and kill every living soul. But soon they got to the very last room and thought she was there. The commander ordered them to break down the door, and when the men did so, the girl opened her eyes. She was not going to be afraid anymore, but just sat calmly in her place and looked at those enemies who came for her soul. This lady was beautiful. She had fair hair, braided back, and incredibly beautiful green eyes. She was like a white lily in the prime of her life. One of the men immediately laughed and said that the rumors were true after all. She really is a beauty. As their commander entered the room, his friend also laughed and, looking at her room, said that he did not expect that a duchess like her could have such a big mess. But their commander did not utter a single word until he entered the room and came as close to the girl as possible. When he was already at her eye level, he immediately told the girl in a cold voice that he was very glad to greet Duchess Edel. The girl herself did not respond to this. She only sat for a while and looked at this black-haired man who was ready to kill her at any moment. After some time of silence, the girl turned to him and asked if it was true that he had come only to execute her right in the room. The man silently took out his huge, powerful sword and, pointing it at her neck, said that this was not so at all. Without taking his eyes off Edel, he also added that by order of the emperor he must take her prisoner alive. The girl didn't even tremble with fear. She just sat and thought about when everything in her life went wrong. She was well aware that she had her share of responsibility in this old chair, and perhaps in some moments she had made some mistake. For a very long time, Edel sat and thought about the honor and pride of a nobleman, and in the end she realized that she was stupid, because she ruined everything because of some nonsense. At that moment, she closed her eyes and realized that even like that she couldn't die the way she wanted. Even after everything that had happened, she wasn't given the chance to go peacefully, without pain. All her life she was simply the perfect Lady Edel of Lancaster, and not long ago she became a duchess. In fact, 3 years ago, many people admired this girl because she was still very little. And besides, her father had died. As soon as Edel passed by them, they could not take their eyes off her and constantly whispered behind her back, discussing her personal affairs. One of the ladies even said that she had heard that the girl was engaged to the Duke of Lancaster. But she thought that even if the Lancasters were one of the 4 most famous families, it was still disgusting in her opinion. The girl thought that it was simply terrible for such a young lady to marry such an old duke. Of course, many other ladies also agreed with her, because that year especially this duke turned into a very disgusting person, not only externally, but also internally. But as soon as Edel began to pass by them, they immediately fell silent, because they thought that she might hear. But even despite all this, they continued to admire the girl a little, because she was a ray of light in the darkness. She was an incredibly beautiful and very strong woman. When all the guests saw her absolutely calm expression, They could not believe that this situation did not bother her at all. She had to spend most of her life with some old man, and her expression was as if she had found the love of her life. Of course, no one could even guess what she was thinking, so Edel remained a mystery to them. Thus, the only daughter of Count Canyon, Edel Canyon, had to marry a not very attractive man. In fact, there were 4 extremely powerful families in the empire, and Edel, who had been raised and groomed to marry into one of these families, simply could not go against her father's will. So in the end, she just went and fulfilled her destiny. And so she lived for a year and 8 months as the wife of a very old duke. Of course, no one around could even imagine that this ideal lady was nothing more than a means for uniting 2 noble families. And thanks to the duke's changed plan to declare independence from the empire, she would end up becoming the wife of a traitor. Immediately after Edel was captured, she was brought to the emperor, who, upon seeing her, was very happy because she had finally become the greatest trophy of this war. The man was very happy that he had taken possession of the second wife of the Duke of Lancaster, and Edel herself stood before him with an absolutely unperturbed expression on her face. She only thought that her whole life was only for one purpose and had absolutely no meaning. Edel could not have her own desires, preferences, and dreams. She only had to grow up and marry well for her father. She had to submit to the will of her family because if she ran away, she would simply fall down on the spot and would not be able to do anything. Of course, Edel couldn't bear the thought of standing on the floor next to death, so she took her old and favorite chair with her to the estate because she couldn't bear the thought of dying on a dirty and cold floor. Even though everyone had already died and there was not a single person left on her side, Edel still had no intention of giving up. She was going to fight until the very end. While the girl was being tried, many aristocrats gathered. They all laughed at her, and turning to His Majesty, asked that this criminal be handed over to him, because he could punish her well. One of the men began to protest and asked that they give him the girl, because he had taken more lives from the enemy than the one who first asked for her life. Many people shouted, laughed, pointed at her, and asked for her soul because they wanted to kill her themselves. And then suddenly one of the girls who was also present spoke up. She said that she thought that none of those present had any dignity left, since they had sunk to such low propositions. But this was also quite understandable, because Edel Lancaster was praised as an ideal noble lady. But now she is a nobody, an ordinary slave who must obey in order to survive. Therefore, she had more and more reasons not to be angry with Edel, because her fate had already punished her greatly. Then the emperor interrupted their conversation. He raised his glass and smiled. This man was in his military uniform, which was even trimmed with gold. His name was DeMarcus Tubery. The man stared at Edel and said that he almost forgot about the greatest figure who contributed to the suppression of the uprising when he was standing right in front of them and wondered if it was right to do this. Then, turning to the crowd, he turned to Laszlo and asked him to tell him if by any chance he needed this woman. The emperor was addressing the very dark-haired fellow who had taken poor Edel prisoner. She quickly looked at him and did not know what would happen now. The emperor continued speaking, saying that if the man suddenly wanted, he could give him the greatest war trophy as a keepsake. Of course, Marcus sat and smiled happily. He waited for an answer from his faithful warrior who had ended this terrible war, and the audience also fell silent. Everyone was incredibly interested in what the man would answer to this provocation. For a while, everyone was silent, and then they began to whisper. One of the aristocrats said that she had married the wrong man, and now her life was simply ruined. After that, they started talking about Laszlo and said that this commoner was thriving because he had recently been made a count, and now they wanted to give him this girl as a trophy. They did not understand why His Majesty was so eager to give him, of all people, the greatest spoils of war, since they believed that he had done no more and no less than all the others. Edel herself sat absolutely silently and only listened to people's conversations and also looked at Laszlo. Of course, the girl knew very little about him. She remembered that this man was a mercenary, but she did not understand how this related to her situation, and all because at that moment he was no different from any other knight for her. But still, the man who brought her to the emperor was Laszlo Kris. This man was the master of the largest mercenary guild in the Calliope Empire, and a man who was put in charge at the very young age of 27. He rose to prominence thanks to his military achievements. For the traditional nobles, he was certainly the greatest threat among the new nobles on the emperor's side. However, because Adel had heard that the nobles treated mercenaries as criminals, looked down on him, and treated him like a commoner, she thought that this would be a very interesting case. All this time she sat and did not take her eyes off him. But when Laszlo turned his head in her direction, she quickly looked somewhere else because she felt awkward. After a short silence, the man finally spoke and said that he was not sure about his decision. Laszlo also said that he still has a shortage of maids in the estate, so perhaps this girl could be useful there. As soon as the emperor heard this, he immediately began to laugh loudly and asked the man if he really wanted to use a woman who was a duchess as a simple maid. Of course, the other aristocrats were horrified when they heard this. They began to whisper among themselves, discussing the situation, but at the same time they continued to listen to the developments. Laszlo explained that he had no other purpose for her, so if she became a maid, she could keep her life, and if not, she could be safely killed. Soon the emperor finally began to calm down and stopped laughing. He said that it was very good of him to do so. When all attention finally returned to the man, he said that he would hand over Edel Lancaster to Count Laszlo, who needed even more maids for his palace. As soon as the girl heard this, she was horrified. She could not believe that this was really the only thing she could get for her patience, to become some kind of servant in the warrior's palace. In fact, 3 years ago there was a huge scandal in her native estate which happened even before the girl married the count. The stepmother created this scandal out of nothing. She shouted at Adel and demanded that she stop being so stubborn, believing that she had no right to challenge her father's decision. The woman insisted that she marry the count, as her father had wanted. Of course, Edel herself was unhappy with this decision. She tried to explain to the woman that this count was much older than her father and did not understand how one could marry him at all. But the woman was not going to listen to any objections. She declared that there would be no other offer as good as this. She also said that this man already has a long-term mistress and that his children are long grown up, so he will not bother her with questions about the heir. So, in her opinion, there is no problem. After a long silence, the stepmother smiled happily and said that when the duke died, they would be left with a large inheritance, and added that if the girl refused this, she would be incredibly stupid. Adel was still very unhappy and said that no one knew when he would die. At least, she believed that until she turned 30, he would still be alive. The stepmother sighed heavily and said that Edel was really still too stupid to understand anything about life. But then she added that, having become a duchess, even her father would have to bow his head before her, and this is a very high status to just refuse it. As soon as Edel heard this, she simply froze in place, and her stepmother asked what exactly she was not happy with. Of course, becoming a duchess of one of the 4 great houses was a great offer, but perhaps she would have accepted if the man had not been so old. That same evening, Edel went to her father and asked him to listen to her, saying that she did not want to marry this man. She tried to get her thoughts across to him and hoped that he would allow her to refuse, but it was a long-standing decision, and of course, her father refused. Moreover, he started yelling at his daughter, accusing her of bringing shame on the family. He said that she should at least actively support them, and asked if she knew what he had sacrificed to get this position. Adel froze in place. She couldn't believe that her father really didn't want to listen to her. He only scolded her and said that she was an ungrateful daughter because he does everything for her, and she, in the end, is not even grateful for such efforts. Without any concern for his daughter's feelings, her father said that the only reason he'd raised her all these years was because it was her duty to get married. That was her only role in life. That's why he was so outraged that she dared to come to him and ask for a refusal. At that moment, Edel seriously considered running away from such a father, leaving the count's estate and starting life from scratch. She endured all this with only one thought, finding relief in the duke's indifference while he was busy with his mistress. She endured everything. She endured the rude words of the duke's maids, who always mocked her. She also had to endure and manage dozens of accounting books and more than 100 employees. Adel endured the reception of guests who arrived every day and arranged long banquets. She was like a puppet who had to entertain these spectators. She endured all this without making a single mistake in carrying out her father's requests. She played her role with a smile on her face, forgot about all her desires and preferences, and was simply the doll that her father wanted to see in front of him. And all this was for the sake of that moment when freedom would finally come to her, when she would finally be able to feel like herself and no longer fulfill her father's requests. But all her hopes were dashed, for it was a vain struggle. No return was planned. She was always to obey her father and carry out his requests, no matter what their nature. One day, when Edel was sitting in her office doing paperwork, her butler suddenly burst in and told her that she needed to run away as quickly as possible. Of course, the girl immediately began to worry. She asked in a trembling voice what had happened, and the butler replied that the emperor's army was already approaching. And of course, up until that moment, she realized that she knew absolutely nothing. She alone was kept in the dark, not told about the news that was happening outside the estate. And absolutely no one said anything about the fact that a plan had been developed for the independence of the Duchy of Lancaster, and so when she got married, everything went terribly. This plan was carried out without her, and ultimately it simply failed miserably, causing great anger in the emperor. And when the girl ran through the empty corridors, then, finally, she realized that she could do absolutely nothing in this world. No matter how hard she tried to fight, it was all useless. She ran through the estate and did not find a single servant, of which there had been many before. So Edel finally realized that she was just a decoy to tie up the emperor's suppression forces. And the life she had dreamed of for so long, the touch of human warmth and just a little bit of kindness, was simply destroyed in an instant. But even after managing all these books and services that she was doing, only one butler came and told her to run. Everyone else did it on their own, saving their own skins. And in the end, Edel couldn't escape from any part of this mansion because there was fire everywhere. As her father wanted, she became the perfect lady. This was the only part of herself for which the girl was praised in her past life. She didn't know if all this suffering was a divine sign that should have awakened her to run away right when it all began. And of course, Edel never thought there was anything worse than death until she found herself in the place she was now. After the emperor's hearing, Edel was sent to prison, where she was to sit quietly and peacefully. Sure, they called her a trophy, but in reality, she was a simple slave. Even though slavery had long been abolished, which is the only reason it is not called that, it still remained in people's lives. At this point, the girls who were also in prison seeing Edel asked in surprise, is she still trying to maintain her high status? One of the girls, who was Lauren Lancaster's first daughter, started yelling at her and said that it was very important, of course, that they now had such a beautiful lady like her in prison. The second daughter, whose name was Daria Lancaster, pointed towards Edel and said that she had been like that since the very first day she got married. They said that the girl even now continues to play the role of a real duchess, despite the fact that she had just been sold into slavery. The girl screamed very loudly and did not understand whether she could really maintain her false face even under such terrible circumstances. The anger continued to grow, and they even began to call Edel various obscene names. Both daughters cried as their lives went downhill. Edel, in turn, just sat and looked at them. She knew perfectly well that this was not the first time they had spoken words of disdain to her, but in fact, it had never been so serious before. So after her daughters fell silent, she put her head down and wondered why Lauren didn't just rest and Daria too, since it had been a hard day for everyone. Edel understood that they had lost absolutely everything, so they were very upset about it and could not contain their emotions. Of course, the girl does not want to waste energy on these senseless arguments and name-calling. So, having calmed the Duke's daughters, she turned away and thought. Edel knew full well that sooner or later there would come a time when they would let their guard down, so she had to at least save enough strength and energy to end her life. Of course, for her, the best option, in her opinion, was to die, rather than live as some kind of toy in the hands of others. Every male member of the Duchy of Lancaster was dead. The Earl of Canyon's family had escaped destruction by renouncing their claim to Edel, meaning they did not acknowledge their daughter. And Count Chris said he would use her as a maid. However, this only means that she will be a young prisoner with no real status. She will always live in a cage and never leave it. Even though Edel was the main criminal, guilty of treason because she was a gift from the Emperor, at least she was locked up in a well-guarded prison. Her eyes slowly began to close, and her thoughts slipped further and further away. She tried to sleep, despite the fact that her whole body was screaming in pain, and her head was splitting into small pieces. She really hoped that after she slept, some good idea would come to her mind, and she would be able to figure out what to do now. She had to think about how she could end her life without causing incredible pain. So soon, closer to the morning, she was finally able to close her eyes and get some sleep. The sun, which was shining through the only window in her cell, began to wake her up. Edel quickly woke up, looked around, and thought that old habits would take a long time to disappear, because despite such exhaustion, she still woke up at the same time as before. Sitting on her wooden leg, she thought that this would be a hard day, because this was the day when she was to be handed over to Count Chris. The girl looked out the only window and understood that she had to find a way to take advantage of the chance and just die to end all this suffering. This moment was quite significant for her, because this was the last morning when she was still alive, because the girl was very serious about ending her life. She watched for a while longer at the small blue light that was shining through the small window. She even thought that this thing was also telling her a final farewell. Despite the fact that she had already made a decision, it was still quite difficult for her to come to terms with it. Coming even closer, she looked at this beautiful blue sky and thought only that it was amazing. Soon after, Edel was brought breakfast, and it was her last meal as a prisoner, and indeed the last meal of her life. At that moment, when she had already finished her breakfast, she suddenly heard some shouts. It was a security guard. He turned to Lauren Lancaster and her sister, saying that they could go out. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately began to pray for these girls. She really wanted them to be spared from any harm that could happen to them on their way. Soon after, people finally came for her, opened her cell and let her out, starting to escort her to the punishment to which she was sentenced. Edel was already completely ready for her death by that time, but she also had one more task that she had to complete. She was going to die, but she was going to maintain her dignity until her last breath, so that she would not be remembered as a weak woman who could do nothing. As soon as she was taken outside, she immediately saw a very beautiful carriage and thought that she could jump out of it while they were driving to the estate. Edel really believed that if the servants who would accompany her were not so vigilant, then she would even be able to pull off this act. She thought that there would probably be a lot of passing wheels in the noble district, so before she got into her carriage, she thought that if she was very lucky and there was a lot of traffic, she could die instantly. She really wanted some inattentive servant to accompany her so that she could still put her plan into action. But at the moment when Edel approached the carriage, she suddenly saw Laszlo in person and realized that he would be her escort. Of course, the girl did not expect such a turn of events at all, so she was incredibly scared. She simply froze in place and now did not know what to do. As soon as Laszlo saw her, he immediately put her in the cart, and they began their journey. The scenery around was beautiful because it was golden autumn. The girl sat opposite her new master and was silent, and the man only occasionally glanced at her. In fact, Edel didn't even think that he would decide to come for her himself. She thought that he would send some butler or maid who would simply look after her. She also believed that he probably came to personally follow her, so that she would definitely not run away or do anything stupid. As soon as Edel noticed his gaze on her, she immediately thought about what she should do if he suddenly wanted to talk to her. Of course, she understood perfectly well that he didn't like her. These feelings were, of course, mutual. After everything that had happened, he had every right to hate her, since he was the commander of the Emperor's army. The girl simply did not know how he could look so favorably at her, the wife of a traitor, a person who was absolutely of no use to anyone. But at that moment, the man finally took his eyes off her and began to take the cape off his shoulders. He threw it towards Edel and did not say a single word. As soon as she saw this, she immediately asked him in a trembling voice why he did this, but Laszlo told her to stop trembling, thereby hinting that she should throw this cape over herself. After he said these words, he immediately turned away and fell silent. The girl felt a little awkward about the situation, but she realized that he assumed she was cold because her hand was shaking. Then she took this cape in her hands and, moving it closer to herself, felt the smell emanating from it. Adel was about to put on this cloak, but then she thought that if she took and threw it at the man, then this might give her a little time to just jump out of this carriage. She believed that while the man was confused and could not see anything because of this red cloth, she would be able to carry out this plan. Adel thought that this was a very good plan. She would simply jump under the wheels and be crushed to death. She assured herself that, of course, she could do it, that she could jump out, because she could already hear another cart coming from afar, which could just about crush her. But Adel still hesitated for a while. She was going to count to 3, and then open the door to jump, and not forget to throw the cloak at the man as a distraction. Gradually, the carriage began to approach, and the girl had already begun to count. But just as she was about to finish the last count, she suddenly heard Laszlo's voice, which said that she had better not do it. As soon as she heard this, she immediately looked the man straight in the eyes in fear. She did not understand how he could even find out about this, but as she looked into his empty gaze, she knew perfectly well that somehow he knew what she was going to do, and that was why he had put her in his carriage. Adel understood that this man would definitely not leave her alone. He would try in every way to interrupt her suicide mission. Of course, she decided not to take any more risks, because she understood that he would take some measures to save her. So closer to the evening they already reached his estate. Laszlo got out first and said that it was time for her to get out too. Meanwhile, Adel remained in the carriage for some time, not knowing what was waiting for her there. Of course, she was very scared by the thought that now she would have to be in this gloomy estate with a man who would not even let her die in peace. She would now live in a real hell. Without thinking twice, the girl immediately began to get out of the carriage. However, because her leg was very inflamed after prison, as soon as she stepped on it, she could not hold on. Adel immediately lost her balance and began to fall. Her leg twisted and she almost ended up on the ground. However, fortunately, there was no impact. Laszlo managed to react in time thanks to his physical training. He ran up and put his chest out, thereby preventing the girl from falling to the ground. As soon as Adel felt something soft that she landed on, she was immediately surprised. She opened her eyes, not understanding why she did not feel pain. After that, she touched the chest of the man who was still standing next to her without saying a single word and raised her head up to see his reaction. Of course, Adel felt very awkward about the situation that had happened, but at that moment, she also remembered a memory from the past. This memory was connected with her dear mother, who said that crying or behaving as you want is not befitting a real lady. Her mother taught her that acting as if you wanted to fall into a man's arms was a cheap and vulgar way to win his heart, and therefore should not be done. So the girl moved away from him pretty quickly and immediately asked for forgiveness. Of course, she really hoped that because of this situation he would not misunderstand her, and everything would be fine. Laszlo, meanwhile, reached forward and took his cloak from her. After that, he walked towards the estate and told her to follow him. As soon as they entered, he immediately turned to the headmistress and asked if he understood correctly that nothing like that had happened in the estate during the time he was gone. As soon as Adel heard about the headmistress, she immediately realized that they were talking about the head maid. Meanwhile, the woman had just run up to the man. She said she was very glad that he had finally returned and also added that nothing unusual had happened. The woman also said that Marcia's housewife takes good care of the property, so he can be sure not to worry even when he goes on long trips. Adel looked at this woman without taking her eyes off her, and did not understand why the butler did not come to the man to report the situation, because this is usually how it happens in noble families. Laszlo, meanwhile, continued talking to the maid and asked if it was true what she said, that she did not have enough maids in her staff. Then he pointed to the girl who stood behind him and said that this was the new maid. So he asked her to use her as she saw fit and teach her everything that was needed. He walked forward and told Marcia to first bathe her, feed her, and take her to her room to sleep. The maid was very surprised to hear this, but Laszlo continued to talk. He said that she could allow her to use any of the rooms that she was no longer using, so she should start working the next day. After that, without waiting for any answer, he went upstairs. Meanwhile, Adel was pleasantly surprised that the man did not force the maid to take her to his room. She was incredibly surprised by the fact that he really decided to use her only as a servant, because she had already imagined other, more terrible things. Marcia herself was incredibly surprised by this turn of events. She sighed heavily, watched the owner leave, and said in a quiet voice that he, as always, said everything briefly and to the point. Meanwhile, another maid ran up to the woman and, turning to her, asked if she had already heard the news. As soon as the head maid heard about this, she immediately asked Mina what had happened. And the maid replied that she had just heard from a knight outside that it was the Duchess of Lancaster, who had all been in captivity after the war. As soon as Marcia heard this, her eyes immediately widened in surprise. The woman could not believe that this was really true. And after that, together with the maid, they began to laugh, saying that she would never have thought that she would ever be in charge of the Duchess. Marcia laughed even more, and turning to Mina, asked her to do everything as the Lord ordered. The woman explained that the maid had to show her the room at the end of the corridor. As soon as the maid heard this, she immediately smiled maliciously and said that she would definitely do everything. After the head maid had given all the instructions, she began to leave and said that she would go and think about what to do with Miss Lady in the future. Meanwhile, Mina finally brought Adele to her room. However, these conditions were simply disgusting. By that time, the girl had already taken a bath and returned to her room. In fact, it was not at all what she expected, but she was pleasantly surprised by the maids, who were even kind to her. Even though they were making fun of her, they were still quite friendly. She now had a change of clothes, and they even brought her food to her room. That's why Adele thought it was pretty sweet of them to put her in a small room, since she didn't need much space. For a while, it even began to seem to her that everything in this situation was telling her that she was no longer a noblewoman, and that she had to get used to this idea. While Adele was in the room and thinking about what kind of life awaited her now, she noticed that she was quite cold. She understands perfectly well that most likely in this house the staff is forbidden to use hot water, so Adele will now have to get used to the fact that even in winter she will have to bathe in cold water. Of course, she thought this whole situation was rather strange, you see. There was no sign that this family could have any financial difficulties. However, this house was so unkempt, considering that it belonged to the Count himself, that it surprised her very much, because she believed that people who have money try to pay as much attention as possible to their own homes. However, Adele quickly dismissed all these thoughts because she knew that nothing good would come of it, so she decided to simply ignore it. At that moment, she had to look at the reality that was now right in front of her nose and accept it as it was. In fact, Adele began to worry a lot because she felt hungry after everything she had been through. So, without thinking twice, she went to the plate that the maids had left for her and was about to take a piece from there, but quickly changed her mind. For a while she doubted whether she should eat, but she decided to satisfy her hunger, and as soon as she tried the first piece, she could not stop. The girl felt a simply excellent taste in her mouth, and she liked it very much. The dish was simply magnificent. In fact, she thought that she would never be able to taste even a small piece of fruit again, because now she was in completely different conditions. Adele was going to give up on her life by ending it. However, of course, she didn't think that death would be her only way out. She simply didn't want to live as a toy in someone's hands, not to live at all. She hated the idea of having to satisfy dirty desires simply because she was a spoil of war. But now Adele was alive, and she was going to fight for everything she wanted to have, so she even wondered if she would get fruit the next day too. She supposed that perhaps Count Chris would not try to get into bed with her tomorrow either. So with that in mind, she went to bed and tried to sleep. Adele would like to taste the sweet nectar of the fruits once again and live quietly, taking care of herself, because this was quite important to her. She believed that if she tried hard enough, she could perhaps lead a simple life as an ordinary maid and not attract unnecessary attention and problems. Before finally falling asleep, she spent some time looking out the window at the beautiful stars that were visible from there. All this time, Adele thought only about how she would survive and would eagerly await the day when she could live in complete peace. At that very time, the emperor was sitting at his desk in his office and drinking his wine. Then suddenly the butler came to him and, turning to him, said that he was a little surprised by the fact that Chris himself came to pick up the prisoner this evening. But the man, smiling happily, said that, of course, he was absolutely sure that the guy would do it. So this news did not surprise him at all. The emperor glanced at his assistant and asked what Laszlo seemed like to him. But before giving him the answer, he also wondered if the guy looked like the man who had been awarded the greatest military spoils of all time. The butler, hearing this question, immediately became a little worried, and then asked what he meant, and also said that he did not know at all how to answer this. The emperor, meanwhile, was silent. He was thinking that, of course, perhaps not everyone knew. However, he knew the true nature of the mercenary king Laszlo. The man knew that this guy had signed the contract and joined the conquest at the last minute. The emperor also knew that Laszlo had only agreed to the treaty for a reward. However, he and his band of mercenaries achieved more than the knights could have imagined. So as soon as the war was over and Laszlo returned to the capital, the emperor met with him and asked him to tell him what the guy wanted. It could be absolutely anything. The warrior thought for a while, and then said that the contract clearly stated how much he needed, so he would not demand more or less. Despite having all this power, Laszlo still had no interest in the social power or status he might gain from what he had done. And on top of all this, in the emperor's opinion, was impudence. He did not understand how a man could be so impudent. But it also showed him a different side of the guy. He thought that Laszlo could probably be the perfect dog, one that would follow any order. But to make him more than just a top hound, the emperor needed to attract him with something that would captivate him. He felt that making him just a count would not be enough. He needed something more substantial than a simple status. And then the man finally figured out what he could do, and the meeting eventually took place about 2 years ago at a victory banquet. Many aristocrats were present at that banquet. After the war, everyone began to dress very nicely and were happy to have such an opportunity to distract themselves a little after such gray days. All the people were drinking, dancing, and also talking. So many were wondering, did that simple mercenary who took part in the war really become a count? And that was actually true. But people started to think that he probably wanted to be treated as an equal, but many people were sickened by the thought of that. So that would have been quite a challenge for them. Of course, the aristocrats had absolutely no idea what His Highness was thinking when he made what they considered such a reckless decision. Even though Laszlo was a very big driving force behind their victory, people still didn't want to accept him or communicate with him in any way. So many simply abandoned the man. And at that ball, the emperor watched the newly minted duke for a long time, so he was able to notice that Laszlo had his eye on Edel Lancaster. Of course, he was a little surprised by this choice, but he decided to try this option that came to his mind at that moment. The die had been cast, so now all he could do was watch it all. He wanted to wish these people luck because he had never lost a bet in gambling, so he was not going to break this tradition. That same evening, Laszlo sat in his office and mentally cursed the emperor for the decision he ultimately made. Of course, Laszlo had no idea that he and the Duchess would cross paths like this, and he wondered why the emperor had done all this. Of course, he also understood perfectly well that because of all these situations that had happened, he would have a severe headache because he would have even more responsibilities. In fact, the only reason he agreed to the emperor's proposal and accepted the hated noble title was so that his little sister could live in a decent family by marrying her beloved. Now that some time had passed, the man realized that perhaps he shouldn't have been so greedy. Even though he had become a noble, he would still be despised by everyone else forever, since he was of common status before and was also a mercenary. It was all obvious how he and his sister would be treated in the marriage negotiations. But despite all the great desires of his sister, Laszlo considered marriages between nobles to be very vulgar, because he had already seen a lot of things during all this time. A father who sells his daughter to some old man in order to establish connections with one of the 4 most famous families is simply immoral, in his opinion. He also considered it very strange that the old duke already had mistresses and grown-up children, but he still agreed to this step and remarried. And in these rough negotiations, the lady who was sold to the highest bidder was Edel Lancaster. She had no voice of her own and could do nothing to contradict her family, who had simply sold her. Even though she was married off to an old product as a second wife, no matter what events she attended, she always smiled and remained positive, at least in public. Laszlo believed that if she had been categorically against this marriage, she would have simply run away. And therefore he was very surprised at what was in the head of a girl who simply exchanged her youth for power out of greed. But also, when he attended these balls and saw this girl there, he did not understand why he could not take his eyes off her, since he considered her actions reckless, very stupid, and selfish. He never had the opportunity to just talk to her anyway. She was always the center of attention, surrounded by various people who controlled her. Unlike Laszlo, who became a nobleman overnight, the girl was born into noble property and lived her life as a noblewoman, so he thought he would never be able to see her again when the war began. He thought that she would be taken away somewhere far away, hidden and protected. However, now, this same Edel Lancaster worked in his house as a maid, and when he thought about this, the situation even surprised and amused him a little. While the man was thinking about all this, it was already completely dark outside. He folded his arms across his chest and thought that this was all because of the treacherous emperor. Laszlo knew that he had given her the former duchess as a warning to those who were plotting against him, or something like that. He knew that if he refused to take this girl, she would simply be sold, or she could kill herself. He believed that these were the only two options that could be present in this situation. After this, Laszlo thought about the fact that she was found in the empty castle of the Duke, after everyone else simply ran away, leaving her completely alone to die. Her biological father cut off all ties with his own daughter just to save his neck, and Laszlo, of course, was against such actions. All those men who, it would seem, should have loved her, simply brazenly abandoned her at the moment of the most terrible thing that could have happened. Of course, Laszlo knew that she would try to kill herself because of all this, because the nobles and their pride are above all else. But the man was very angry because he did not understand what she was trying to protect by giving up her life. He decided not to worry about it too much anymore, so he blew out the candle and went to his bed. Laszlo was going to keep her with him because that way he could find a use for her, and maybe then she would get rid of these stupid thoughts about suicide. He would really like for her to be able to somehow distance herself from her past, forget about all of this, and move on. Laszlo believed that in that case her life would not be the worst. Everything would get better with time and everything would be fine. Several hours passed from that moment, and finally the morning came. Edel woke up quite early so that the headmaid would give her the necessary chores, and she could quickly begin to carry them out. But as soon as she began to perform her duties and changed into her uniform, even the headmaid began to mock her. This maid pointed her finger at her and asked her if she understood correctly that in the Duchess's own house they also used such dirty rags to do various household chores. Marcia laughed loudly, and the other maid supported her. After that, she asked if the Duchess was afraid of getting her soft hands dirty when she had to wash these rags. But then she said that there must have been another maid doing this, so the Duchess had no idea what it was. Edel, in turn, lowered her head, did not want to run into a scandal, so she said that she would do everything better. Marcia said that of course she simply had to do it, and then turned to the maid, Sally, and asked if she was sure that they had trained the girl properly. The maid immediately froze in place and said in a trembling voice that, of course, they explained everything to the Duchess quite clearly and extensively, so that she could understand and do everything without mistakes. But at that moment, the head maid laughed again and told the others not to leave her under any circumstances and to watch carefully every action of this woman. Pointing her finger straight at Edel, she said that this girl was a traitor from the House of Lancaster who had been captured by their master, so no one knew what she could do at all, so she definitely needed to be watched. But before the head maid left, the maid she was talking to anxiously asked if there wouldn't be any bad repercussions, even if she said such things. Marcia, still laughing, asked what she was afraid of. Did she really think the Duke would come back from the grave for his poor wife? The maid began to laugh at her own brilliant, in her opinion, joke, and the other maids at that moment began to whisper, discussing her words and actions. Before closing the doors for good, the maid said that they should not worry, so they could treat her however they wanted. Edel stood there at that moment and just said nothing. She was very surprised by what had happened at all, because from the very beginning when Marcia spoke on that first day, she had not understood what she meant. But now she guessed. Edel believed that the maid wanted to show everyone how magnificent she was, while using a former duchess like her to increase her authority at her expense. Marcia had been acting like this ever since she introduced her to the rest of the staff on her first day at work. Adel even began to think that she only wanted to bring her to tears, to show that such a great one, formerly a duchess, would give up so quickly. But the girl considered that all this was a completely unnecessary action, because there was probably no one else who would be happier about the demise of the House of Lancaster. Soon the door closed, and then the maids were able to breathe a sigh of relief, happy that she had finally left. And so the maid, with whom Marcia spoke the most, said that she could not believe that such a woman had the nerve to talk about the dead in such a way. It was a difficult subject for her, so she did not understand how she could do such a thing. Her friend came closer and said that such nonsense was not surprising at all, because they were already busy. So the girl did not understand why she was even coming to them to say something else of her own, completely unrelated to work. Salia was the maid in charge of the laundry, and Madame Marshall had specifically chosen her to train this former duchess, which put her in a very awkward position. Of course, Adel knew perfectly well that if they started pestering them again because she hadn't washed the laundry, it would make life absolutely difficult for everyone who worked in that very laundry. So she didn't want anyone to get hurt because of her. So Adel went back to work after the scandal and decided to finish what she already had in the bucket at that time. The girl put an incredible amount of effort into washing everything thoroughly. Of course, she was not at all interested in the fact that someone was making fun of her. But the problem was that she was not sure that she had enough stamina to withstand all this work that was being placed on her fragile shoulders, which were completely unaccustomed to such loads. All of this is possible because Adele is alive, so she decides to just be grateful that she's not somewhere worse. At this very moment, Adele's father learned of the news, and he became so angry that he even threw a cup at his desk and broke it. He didn't understand how this useless brat could even be his daughter. The man couldn't control his emotions, so he gave them free rein. Of course, his son came running to the loud sounds and, seeing his father in a cheerful mood, asked what had happened. He also heard the news and wondered how it was possible that Adel had become this mercenary's maid. But his father did not answer his words and questions. He only shouted at William, telling him not to mention this useless girl in their house anymore. He considered his daughter an ungrateful girl who would not even have the decency to end her life before she was taken and humiliated like this. In fact, sometime before this happened, Dustin met with the Emperor and asked him to believe that the Duke of Lancaster was blackmailing him into helping him commit this treason. Almost crying, the man said that this Lancaster took his daughter and turned her against him, thus holding her hostage. And since he was her father then, of course, he simply had no choice. In order for nothing to happen to his daughter, he simply had to agree to this. After a short silence, the Emperor said that he understood everything perfectly, and then smiled. He also added that if he insisted that House Canyon was innocent, then he was absolutely sure that he had nothing to say about what had happened to Duchess Adele. As soon as he heard about this, he immediately thought that everything was going according to his plan. So he told His Highness that, of course, it was all so. Kneeling before the Emperor, he suddenly began to shout and said that when a daughter marries, she is no longer part of the land, so she had absolutely nothing to do with them from the moment she left. Dustin was forced to kneel and beg the Emperor for mercy, not to mention offering him the Duke's family secrets in addition to half of all his assets. The man managed to survive, despite all the ridicule and humiliation that he also had to endure. Demarque of the Imperial House of Tubery took the throne after his incompetent father, and attracted a commoner in order to strengthen the power for his throne. He is not afraid of sinister and evil methods. As long as the end justifies the means, the man is ready to go to absolutely any methods. Demarque is trying to make an example out of the house to keep the high nobles in line. He turned this incompetent idiot into a dirty mercenary. He believed that the Emperor was doing this to tarnish the reputation of House Canyon and warn other nobles that the same thing could happen to them at any moment. So, after calming down a bit, Dustin told his son that this was exactly what their sister had been trying to do all along. Of course, Dustin didn't understand how such a man could even make fun of her. He thought that his daughter thought she could avoid being manipulated by her great father. He then turned to his sons, William and Geoffrey, telling them to keep a fairly low profile in society for a while. He explained that since the emperor had acquired a faithful hound, he had nothing more to fear. The sons did not say anything more, but simply agreed with their father. He was just going to wait and watch for a while. At that moment, he stepped on the shards of the cup, thinking that he could build his family anew. Dustin was a pretty self-confident person, so he was going to make sure that no one could ever look down on their family again, and he didn't care how much effort it took. Some time had passed since then, and Edel had already begun to adapt to work at the estate. So after another batch of washing, she went outside to hang it all up, when suddenly she heard someone approaching her and calling her by name. When the girl looked back, she saw Selah and was very surprised, because she asked her to wait for them too. And next to her was also Layla. Selah, smiling, also held a large barrel of clean linen in her hand and said that hanging it out to dry would not be easy enough to do on your own. And that's why the girl suggested doing it together, because then it would be more effective, all because they were also heading there and could help. Of course, Edel did not object to the offer of help, and soon they came to the right place and began to hang out the sheets. Once the work was done, the girl lingered outside for a while, and looking at the sky, she realized that 10 whole days had already passed since she arrived at this house. And if anyone had asked her what she was doing in that house, Edel would have been able to proudly tell them that she was simply a spoil of war and had worked diligently as a maid in the laundry, performing absolutely every duty that was given to her. And thanks to this, she now began to wash clothes very well, so that this work took her less and less time. Be that as it may, if Adele had to complain, she would definitely complain about Madame Bon, who continued to come to her only to pester and mock her. Marcia would constantly come to her and mock the Duchess, saying that her linen was still in the same mess, while knocking over a bowl of clean water and things that the girl had recently washed. The woman was an incredibly angry person, and she mockingly asked if she really intended to ignore her, but she also suggested that the girl might just be too boring for all this. The maid constantly laughed at her, and sometimes was even ready to raise her hand. And at one of those moments, Selah decided to stand up for her. The girl stepped forward, and turning to the madam, she said that considering that she had only just started learning, she was doing quite well. Of course, all the maids were fed up with this kind of behavior. So Selah said that she had trained her well and asked why Marcia didn't go back to her place and do her own job. Of course, the head maid was very surprised by such a burst of courage and was about to ask what she meant. But Selah interrupted her and said that she was in charge of the laundry, and they were already a little behind schedule, so she asked Marcia to stop doing that. Being busy is one thing, but when someone just shows up and disrupts everyone else, that's too much. Selah continued to shout at the head maid, pointing to the dirty rag, and turning to Edel, she asked why the girl didn't show the maid how to make it clean and beautiful. But Marcia said she had no use for this show, and as she went to the door, she said she would leave them for now. However, they must know that she would always be watching. As soon as the door closed, Edel immediately became alarmed and asked if Selah really had the right to say that. But the maid, who was still nervous, asked why she shouldn't do it, since she hadn't done it for the Duchess personally, so she didn't have to worry about it. She also asked that they be sure to come to them if Marcia continues to do this. Edel even blushed a little because she felt very pleased by such an act, and said that she was incredibly grateful to her. Selah also said that the girl shouldn't worry because she certainly won't take revenge on them. Their food might be a little less because of this, but she doesn't see it as a big problem. She also said that if this really happens, then in a few days everything will be forgotten and return to normal. After that, leaving, she said that she still has a lot of work, so she offered to return to performing duties. As soon as Edel looked back, she noticed that all the other maids continued working as if the scandal had never happened. Of course, for the girl, everything that was happening around her was a little surprising, especially the fact that Selah was helping her as if she didn't care at all that the girl was a spoil of war. But she was still a little irritated by the head maid, who was definitely against her. And the other maids suffered precisely because of their strained relations. Edel didn't even have a chance to talk to them or ask what they thought about all this, so she could only hope that she didn't cause them too much trouble. When night fell, Edel finally returned to her room because her work shift was over. She sat on her bed and looked at her hands, which were covered in calluses. She really hoped that the other maids were okay, and also thought that they simply did not have time to think about anyone else. Edel was completely unaccustomed to this amount of work and water, so her hands immediately began to react to all this, and she did not even have any cream to solve this problem. She was worried about the maids, but Count Chris hadn't asked her about them even once in the last 10 days. The girl even had the feeling that he had forgotten about her existence. Quite quickly, Edel threw all these thoughts away and was simply happy that she could live peacefully as a maid. She didn't know what would happen to her for thinking badly about the dead quite often, but in fact she was very happy and grateful that she was able to get rid of Lancaster. Looking around, she saw crystal clear cleanliness, and before falling asleep, she thought that the next day she was going to do absolutely everything possible to do the job just perfectly. When she lay down in the cold bed, her trembling passed rather quickly because she fell asleep. But before that, she prayed that this day would also end peacefully. Edel believed with all her soul and prayed that the night would remain as calm as she felt inside. She also hoped that the next day she would be able to bite into the apple that brought her so much pleasure. However, after some time, Edel suddenly heard some strange sounds outside her door and immediately woke up in horror. She didn't understand who it could be at such a late hour, and then she assumed that it could be Count Chris, and she became afraid that he could change his mind about his decision not to sleep with her. Edel was indeed incredibly frightened, and with a trembling voice she turned to the door, which was closed, asking who was there.